trying to mess around with YouTube today. So if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It looks like something's happening. I don't know.
I see 99% in the corner, so it must be good.
Oh, it's doing something. Oh, I wonder if there's a delay. Yeah, I can see me. I can see you. Okay, this for the YouTube person or robot that's watching. This is a first. So, all right. And a first time having him on the show. Welcome, Dr. Brother Johnathan Kopel.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for having me on here.
Yeah, I've not had a Dr. Brother before, so this is a first. But
so with everyone you've had, you never had another doctor. I thought you had a few other doctors on the show.
I got to think about that. Yeah. I can't recall ever having a medical doctor, maybe like a PhD doctor, but
I would think a PhD doctor for sure, I would say.
Yeah. And Johnathan is well traveled here in the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. He is now a new affiliated member of Potomac Lodge number 5, but I have seen you here at my lodge, St. John's Lodge number 11, and you've traveled to the Colonial Lodge, and you are just an example of a traveling man who joins us from the grand jurisdiction of Texas. We're into the second episode this season on the whole discussion of the petitioning and how to become a Mason. And the first episode, we talked about the question on the belief in the immortality of the soul. For this episode, I gave you the assignment and said, hey, let's talk about the whole deity and why we are asked, do we believe in God, higher power, grand or supreme architect of the universe? Why is this question such a landmark question in Freemasonry, in your opinion?
Well, that's actually interesting because last night we had a EA degree over at Benjamin B. Franklin Lodge. And so we had 2 people that went through and they had that same question asked. I think ultimately it has to do probably, I would say, from putting all things together from my personal experience in life and from the craft. I think a lot of it has to do with what our ultimate focus is. Because thinking about the experiences I've had, the ultimate existential angst that people have really boils down to a lot of the deeper questions that we don't ask. So after the new EA went through his degree, I actually talked to him about this specifically. I said that from my experiences as a physician, the things I've noticed with people, especially with one patient in particular, was how he talked about his regret of not engaging with these questions. What do you really believe in? If there is a higher power, who is this entity? Who is this person or persons in some traditions? And I think that ultimately boils down to asking those questions about why we do what we do now and what we're hoping for in the future.
And I'm trying to recall the wonderful conversation we had into the late hours a few weeks ago. Yeah, well, I'm glad you do. I'm sitting here in my brain. I'm like, we literally went up to the heavens and came back down. And I tried to remember as much as I could as I was preparing, our outline for our discussion tonight on this very important episode. And I think one of the things that we discussed was the grand architect of the universe, and how most of Masonic ritual, they refer to the letter G with the relationship in geometry, but we actually do use the G word. We'll say God. We will also use that name when we're talking about biblical passages. But of course, Freemasonry is open to all faiths and traditions. So grand architect of the universe is going to be kind of how we refer to it tonight, or right. Deity. But how do you explain that, the mystery of the universe and the existence of this deity?
That actually is an important question. I think what we had talked about in our conversation before is like the different conceptualizations of God throughout time and how that's evolved from the early civilizations to the present. I think what stands out to me amongst all these traditions is how at the underlying basis is the relationship of the individual to God. And within Freemasonry, I think what's really helped kind of me engage with that question more is really looking at other traditions. So if you look at the Hindu tradition in particular, there's this idea of like a pantheistic view of God, meaning that God is actually the same as creation. They're one and the same, and that what we see in reality is more of a illusion or a emanation of God's very being. So in one sense, God's knowable. In one sense, God is unknowable through a more Hindu conceptualization. What I find very interesting about that conception is that it brings about this idea. If you look at from the Masonic traditions, or if you look at the ideas presented, it really brings forth the idea that ultimately, when we're talking about God, it's really about finding our relationship to God and seeing that we're all interconnected in one sense or another. I think that's the ultimate theme that connects a lot of these different traditions, is that there's an interconnectedness that it stimulates, so that it's not just you as an isolated individual thrown into the world with no connections whatsoever. It's about saying that there's something much larger that connects you to everyone else, including this thing that we call God. And I think the more that you look into that, I think there's a lot of beautiful things that helps with our understanding of death, and even understanding of how other different religious systems can help us understand more about God. Even if we don't participate in those traditions, it gives us at least another lens of looking at it.
Yeah. And I like that you put it that way. And here's the thing that I like most about Freemasonry is that, like, I'm sure most people listening to this podcast, you were born and your family had a tradition or a belief or a value system that was impressed upon you as a small child, and you continued to follow that. For me, I grew up in the southwest part of Arizona. We went to a Baptist church. That's what I thought everybody did. I had no idea about, the Catholic faith, the Mormon faith, the Jewish faith. All of these other systems were completely foreign to me. I knew the Bible. I went to vacation Bible school every summer, and boy, don't miss that anymore. But it wasn't until I got back into Freemasonry, and I wasn't seeking religion when I joined Freemasonry. I was just curious what it was all about, and the Revolutionary War, and the ties to American history, and the leadership, and George Washington, and how could I become a better man. But weave through all of that, the constant thread is this story that we are being told, that's being reinforced by the building of your temple. As you pointed out, we're going there to build our symbolic temple, our spiritual temple, our body here on earth, so that we can have a better relationship with deity, whoever or whatever we believe that thing to be. What I find beautiful is what you had jumped out by saying. It was like, oh, well, this culture believes it this way, this culture believes it that way. When did you decide that you wanted to start reading more or exploring more on how other people, what their belief systems were? Was that because of Freemasonry, or was that something that was already inside of you?
So I would say it was before. I've always been interested, very curious to begin with. I've always been wanting to learn from other traditions, partially because even if you don't believe everything within a tradition, you have disagreements. There's writers within each tradition that have very important wisdom and perspectives that we can take regardless of, other issues that we may disagree with. But I think as I went through my PhD training, especially when I went through medical school, there was opportunities for me. They had interfaith groups where I trained at, to where I actually had more exposure to different traditions as well. That was when I was able to go to the mosque for the first time with one of my professors and one of my colleagues, which was a really interesting experience. I went to my first Jewish synagogue, and I also was introduced to a lot of other traditions along that lines. It was actually only until I moved to DC where I had even more exposure to that from two different perspectives. One, from being a doctor, where that becomes a big part of what you deal with, especially when you're in an intensive care unit, and those issues do come up often and very frequent. On the other hand, from my personal interactions here, there's more opportunities from both in the Masonic tradition here, at least in DC, to be able to interact with people from different faiths. If you go to the Midwest, I think we talked about this too, you usually have a very Protestant background with most people you meet, usually Catholic. You might meet people that are Muslim, even Hindu, but you don't really see a lot of the other flavors. In DC, I'm actually in discussions with one guy in the Zoroastrian tradition, which is extremely fascinating to actually have that conversation and see a lot of the similarities and branchings that you can see from Zoroastrianism to a lot of the Abrahamic faiths in the way that they describe God and the interactions between human beings and the deity. But in addition to that, it's also having opportunities to meet people within the Sikh tradition. Also, even within Christianity, to meet people who practice Christianity differently. So a lot of the patients that I've actually treated and worked with were from Ghana or Ethiopia, some even from South Africa and other African nations. the way they practice Christianity is completely different. Even as you know, there's the Haitian Lodge in DC, which has their own flavor where they can bring some of the traditional voodoo aspects or even traditional Haitian spirituality as well.
Mm-hmm.
That I think has been helpful for me because what I notice is that by studying the ideas within Freemasonry, you can understand how symbols within the craft have similarities to other religious traditions. So even if you don't fully understand that religious tradition, you can pull from that knowledge and have good conversations. I felt like that was one of the interesting things that really helped with being able to engage with people that you may not fully understand their complete theological or even philosophical beliefs.
I'm digesting all of that. And while you're talking, I was thinking of like some of the personal reading and research that I've done. And it was because of Freemasonry. I would have never studied Buddhism, for example. And the bookshelf behind me, there is the Beginner's Guide to Buddhism.
Right.
I'm not ashamed to admit that I have a copy of that. I've purchased a English version of the Quran to read that because I was really into some of the ancient Egyptian mysteries and wanted to try to see if I could connect some,
Right.
some thoughts there. And because of Freemasonry, I've done this because I wanted to know more of the story than just the one flavor that I've heard for most of my life. Was there anything that was significant that that's kind of stuck with you or inspired you from another tradition that now you're kind of proud to say this is a piece of me?
Yeah, I would say the two traditions that I felt like actually had a lot of overlap to Freemasonry. One has actually been Sufism, which has really surprised me. If you look at a lot of the Sufi beliefs, of course, there's different groups of Sufis, but a lot of their focus is actually on this kind of universality with regards to God and being able to explore that not only within one's faith tradition, but beyond that. And when you look at some of their symbolism and ideas, there's a lot that you can see that kind of, in a way, takes the lessons that are taught within the degrees and expands on that further. So I thought that was very surprising. The other tradition that really surprised me the most was the Hindu tradition. So in DC, there is a Hindu temple that's like in the northeastern part, I would say of Maryland. It's like right on the border between the DMV area. And I think it's called the Sri Vishnu Temple, if I remember correctly. I might have mispronounced it, but what's interesting is that that temple has dedicated to Vishnu and Shiva, for the two main deities in the Hindu tradition, including Brahman as well. They have their kind of Trinity aspect to it. What was interesting was one of my physicians that's my mentors took me there. I went there twice. The second time I went with them. What was interesting is if you go to a Hindu temple, it's very noisy. It's not quiet. They have a lot of music going on. There's actually a lot of people in there. There's chanting at certain temples. So they actually will have on specific days, the priests will go and they'll actually have these huge ceremonies to essentially prepare the deity to be presented to the followers of a particular faith.
Wow.
What was interesting is that at the same time, people will be going to other gods within each tradition and having their own expressions. And when I talked to my mentor, he mentioned something I thought was really interesting. He said, the idea of the Hindu tradition is that we don't judge people based upon which god they worship, how they worship, and where they're starting. Because the way we view it is people have their own paths, their own personalities, their own backgrounds. And who am I to judge someone's particular tenor of faith where they start at? Because ultimately it's God trying to reach out to them where they're at and being able to help us reach that same point. And I like that because you can take that lesson to anything with the patients I deal with, whether they're easy or difficult, whether they're having different struggles, even difficult people I work with. Everybody's on their own journey. Some people are further along than others by maturity or spiritual awareness. And we all have to remember that we're all just trying to learn and get better at our own pace.
Mm-hmm.
And having that perspective, I found, gives you that kind of what I call extending your cable toe so that you don't lash out at people that may irritate you and just realize that they're still learning as much as you are.
Yep.
And I think that gives you kind of the grace from a personal perspective to be a little bit more kind and compassionate to people and realize that we're all trying to do our best at the end of the day.
And as we kind of noted, like weaved into all of this as you're talking, I'm thinking of all of the lessons that come throughout our ritual. Even mentioned to us in the opening and the closing of the lodges, we hear this message being reinforced. And another thing that made me smile was just thinking, in the one big takeaway I have from the limited study I've done in Buddhism is the idea of seek to understand.
Right.
And I've really embraced that as kind of like my personal motto. So as you're saying this, like, it's not so much questioning the intent of the individual. It's trying to understand their motivations.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to be, as you say, compassionate, understand what are the other surrounding facts that cause people to take the actions that they take, the bigger full scope of understanding. With the idea that life is just one big experience, right? And this is what I love about Freemasonry is having these discussions with brothers like you. I couldn't write a character in a book or tell a story and make up somebody like you. Like, you're just such a unique individual, and us getting this time together, we're learning from each other. And that's what, makes, I think, what we call the ancient and gentle craft of Freemasonry so special and so unique. So we're doing this episode and we're talking about the belief in deity. And I have asked this question before. I wanted to get your answer because the one that was given to me is kind of a three-parter. But why is it important or almost necessary for a man who has an interest in joining Freemasonry to believe in deity?
I think it has to do with the fact that if you look at the idea of the letter G, when you think about that, the one aspect is we always say it's about God. The other aspect that talks about geometry, and there's this whole spiel that talks about geometry from a very analytical perspective, right? But it was only until later on I started realizing that it's not really the physical geometry it's talking about, but it's talking about the geometry or the inner structure of your person, right? So as a neurologist, it kind of makes me think about how do we understand the different layers of who we are from a physical perspective, a spiritual perspective, and other perspectives as well. And I think that in order to understand yourself, you need to understand not only yourself, but God. And that can only happen if there is some type of relationship there. And I think that to understand yourself is to understand God. So in other words, it's about having that belief in deity in a two kind of way. Communication helps you to not only understand God, but it also helps you to understand yourself. So I kind of view it as a way of, if you don't have a belief in deity, it's sort of like you only have 50% of the reality that you can perceive, and that the awareness of what you're expecting to see. So in other words, is that if you don't have that belief in deity, you actually limit the questions and perspectives you have before you've even begun.
Okay. I like that. Yeah. The answer that I got, it was a three-parter. And not to sound like a parent, but when I said, why is it that we have to have this belief in deity? And the brother looked at me and said, well, it's because that's what we're told.
Right.
Which it is repeated several times throughout the degree process. Like, you must profess this belief, you must accept this. But it's not going to work out for you if you don't have a belief. You don't have to be the person that sits in the front row or the first pew at church. You don't have to have chapter verse memorized, but you at least have to believe that this exists. Because if not, everything else that we talk about in Freemasonry, all of the other wonderful lessons, they're really going to miss the mark. You're never going to get that full connection, as you were saying. So I like that you said the 50% part of it. The other two are kind of my spins on why I think it's important to have that belief in Freemasonry. One is that it's a testament that you believe in something bigger than yourself. So you don't have the I'm a God factor. You believe that there is a God, that there's something that reigns supreme over you, and that you answer to that person, to that belief system. The third one is really important because Freemasonry is all about obligations that we take as we go through the degrees. And how can I trust you if you can't put your hand on something and say, I swear to believe to do this, 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 and this, if I know that you don't believe in the existence of that thing? I can't take you for your word because I don't know.
But maybe it's maybe it's actually more about, from a spiritual perspective, that, because, you know, everyone takes obligations, like even within the medical field, like we take obligations, but it's not as much as you taking the obligation per se for some organization, but it's about your relationship to God. You know, like that's one of the things that, you know, in the degrees, they have a time for the candidate to pray to whichever deity or God they believe in. It's really about that inward relationship aspect of things as much, because those obligations are much more about your walk with God and the way that you try to manifest what it means to practice what is good.
Yeah. Beautifully put. And it kind of leads to the next question that I wanted to get to, where we talk about one of the necessary requirements of being a Freemason is you have to be freeborn.
Yeah.
We've had this discussion on other podcast episodes, but just to catch a listener up who may not be up to speed, our listener on this one, it's not the idea that you weren't born a slave. It's the idea that believe that it's the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's the best way I would describe being freeborn. Because it's such a founding and important part of all of the brothers that came before us that established what Freemasonry is about. So what I'm curious with, Johnathan, is how the modern day process of theology, how does that apply to understand when it comes to the role of like self-determination? Like we make choices in our spiritual and everyday life.
Well, that kind of leads to a hairy conundrum theologically, especially because then you start getting to conversations on free will, predestination, pretty much everything about what it means to be human, right? So you have in the Christian tradition, like traditional Christian tradition, I'm talking about like modern day Protestant views. A lot of times, if you go to a church, they'll say that God has perfect foreknowledge of the future. In other words, it's like God understands everything that can and can't happen, essentially. There's other people that will say that God is holy, you know, in the deist perspective, they'll say God makes the universe and leaves it alone and everything just runs to its whim and there's no personal impact that it has to him. So that's one element to it. Some people, like I mentioned, the Hindu tradition, they view it as God and the universe are one. It's more of this relationship of understanding that everything is one. I think that one of the interesting things that if you look at more of the mystical traditions is that it's much more, especially like in Christianity, or if you look at people like Thomas Merton, if you look at like within the Sufi tradition, if you look at all these different traditions, there's actually much more what you can call a panentheistic view or an open theist view. In other words, it lets go of the idea that God needs to be in control all the time. In other words, is that God can actually participate with the universe as it is. It doesn't mean that God's fully in control, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't have the ability with everything in the universe to bring about outcomes. I think that ultimately these different perspectives influence the way that people approach decisions they make, as well as, especially like when it comes to topics of end of life care, those type of perspectives can either be very detrimental to the way people view their own predicament, or it can be very empowering to help them realize that it isn't God saying, well, he determined me to have X and Y happen. Because if you really take some of these perspectives, they can give you these interesting conundrums where they essentially make God the perpetrator of everything that is bad. Which is very interesting, because then that leads to a lot of uncomfortable things, especially as a doctor, where you're like, well, I have this patient here, he's 18 years old, he's relatively lived a straight life, there's nothing that he personally did morally, but he has sickle cell anemia, or he has a really bad cancer, or, you know, he just lost half his family in an accident and now he's dealing with his own medical problems. Like, it leads to this idea that in a way God is almost the instigator, or if he did know about it, he didn't do anything to prevent it. It leads to a lot of this angst that you can see in people. Also, it leads to interesting questions too, because if you talk about the idea of miracles, especially in the medical field, when those are brought up, it also leads to the question, well, why does this person get a miracle and I don't? Did God, for, you know, like how does God make that determination then? So, you know, it leads to a lot of these interesting questions about God's, what people would say, sovereignty. So the view I would take is more of an open theist view, if you want to put it that way, or much more of a panentheist view. And to kind of simply put, it's more of an unfolding aspect of reality when we talk about the Big Bang and creation to the present. It's much more about God being a part of this unfolding reality of ours from the beginning of time to the present, and working with each of the circumstances that comes up to bring about the good. And sometimes bad things do happen, but with all the interactions and possibilities that are available, God can interact to help things go on the ways that he wants, and still be able to use things like in the medical field that are bad, but still have something good happen. And I always think about, from the symbol within the lodge, a lot of lodges see the pictures of the checkered pavement. It's a reminder that you can still have a stable foundation and still have a path forward, even with the good or the light or the dark, the evil and the bad in life can still come together to form something that is good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to think that God is much more like that than simply determining every single thing that happens in your life.
I like the way you put that. And I was thinking I was going to use a big bowl of ice cream analogy,
Right.
but then I'm like, wait a second, Forrest Gump already said that life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. But on the serious,
a good analogy.
Yeah. But I love the way that you answered that question, and that you've opened up my thoughts to this, because it's one of the things that I love about Freemasonry is that I know my lodge night is the first Friday of every month.
Right.
I so look forward to going to lodge. That's my time. It's on my calendar. Many things are movable in my life except for that lodge night. Unless it's a major emergency, you can bet you will see, Brother Arce there. Now about that is I do feel a reason to be there, that I'm compelled out of an obligation that I made. But the other part of it is that I really like the men that I'm around, my brothers, and talking with them. And it's these experiences, and this is what life is about, right? It's talking about what we've seen through our lens, giving somebody a unique perspective on something, and then throwing the ball and then waiting for them to pass it back. And like, okay, now you tell me something. And if anything, that also kind of plays into the two parts of the question, right? Why do you have to believe in deity? Why do you have to believe in the immortality of a soul?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't get those two, you're not going to understand what life is really all about. And you're just going to be staying home and eating ice cream every night because that's what makes you happy. And there's whole world is out there that with all these unique experiences that are painful, that are enjoying, that are fun, that are scary, all the motions, it's all out there. Go find it.
Yeah. I mean, it's also what I think about from my, finishing my first year in residency in particular, is that if you don't really handle those two questions, the one that you have the most difficulty that will come to you is death. And that's when that's when these questions really come into foray, is when you talk about death. And that's something that I've noticed is the underlying theme amongst all this, is that when you don't confront death, it's like a ticking time bomb that you're avoiding addressing the underlying issue of the human experience. And that's something that I feel like is very interesting, because when one philosopher, I remember reading when it comes to medical education, one of the authors that I read talked about Heidegger, who was a philosopher. He actually talked about what he described as death anxiety, and that when people do not face death, their own death, and understanding that, they will try to replace it, that fear and that anxiety, with things to distract themselves. Whether it's a career, whether it's even family, other things to distract from that impending doom. Because what we do is we minimize death by making it something distant in the future. We always, and especially in the hospital, it's interesting where people will interestingly be subjective about saying that it's more tragic that a younger person gets very ill versus an older person. In reality, it's equally as bad, because you see the impacts it has on both people. It's just that what we think is that death is something that's distant. We think, oh, okay, like someone who's younger, they still have a lot to live for. From my time as a doctor, I've seen people who have passed away in their 30s. I've seen people who have had terrible illnesses in their 20s. And there's no rhyme or reason to it per se. Sometimes it does just happen. And so ultimately, this question is this lingering question that's behind all of us. And sometimes we try our best not to address it. So when you were talking about the immortality of the soul and why God is important, it's because it forces you to ask the hardest question that no one can give you the answer for 100%. There's no scientist that can do it. There's no doctor. No one can say, what happens after I die? No one can tell you that. There's people that will say you die and that's it. There's many perspectives on it, but no one can give you that 100% certainty. And I think that's what terrifies people at the end of the day, is no one can give them the final answer. But I think if I've learned anything from being a doctor, the problem is that we're not looking at what God has given us to understand. Most of the answers that we need is through the relationships that we have. It's by understanding human beings. The issue is that we complicate things, and we think that we have to accomplish so much, or we have to do all these different activities to justify who we are, when in reality, there's already enough for us to understand what could be out there beyond death. And I think that's where it takes a lot of the imagination and kind of that interactions within the Masonic Lodge to understand how you were mentioning about different brothers, how I've been fascinated. I met one guy who I never would have thought. It turns out he's into dancing. This, and it was funny where there's
like ballroom dancing or break dancing.
He does what is it? I think he does salsa dancing or something. Like he's actually really big into it. But in the Masonic Lodge, you would never think some of these guys that would ever be involved in these things, because some of them are very big, burly guys, but then they're like, oh yeah, I dance all the time. And that's what I like, is being surprised by people. And that's what I love about it, because you never know. The person that will have the biggest impact on you might be the strangest person you've ever met. And that's where I feel like in the lodge, sometimes it's one person you meet that says something or has a relationship with you that tells you the most important lessons you need to know. And I think that's what I find interesting, is that when I've been to different lodges, there's always one or two people I meet that really not only mentor me, but they teach me something that I would have never learned as a doctor if I'd never been exposed to different paths that people have taken.
Yeah. Yep. Very true. And you just saying that, I was thinking of just handfuls of brothers that, treasures and things are not what's precious and important to me. It's the relationships that I have with people. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking of like all of these brothers who I've met from maybe just a few hours or known for quite some time, that in some way said something, did something that made an impact on me, and it stuck with me. And I try to, continue that in my everyday life and in conversation. So yeah, I'm feeling you on that one. We've talked about Freemasonry's ritual, how it kind of traces back to the ancient rites of passage, where lessons were given to those who were deemed worthy to receive it. Our story in Freemasonry really revolves around the building of King Solomon's Temple. We've talked about that a lot on our podcast episodes. Less on the building of King Solomon's Temple, but really the deeper lesson there is that we're building our symbolic temple as speculative Freemasons, that we're builders and we're trying to connect and make that relationship better with deity. How have the lessons and virtues of Freemasonry kind of synchronized? You've talked about your daily practice of religion and in your profession, but how have you found the overlap there and forming that better relationship or understanding with God?
I think, that's actually a good question, because I think it's been multiple different sources, but what I can say is that I think that by focusing and understanding the ritual as something to be reflected on, and to actually learn to ask the questions rather than actually feel like it needs to be given, was probably the most important lesson. Because in my work as a doctor, when you're trying to find a question, there's so many people that are in the profession that you can look things up. You try to gain knowledge from all these different sources to be able to solve X or Y problem. It's not, you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. But in Freemasonry, the different understandings and ideas that are presented are not going to just be given to you. In other words, if you ask people, they'll give you a different response, or they may just say, I really don't know. But at the end of the day, what it taught me was that the ability and the duty to ask questions, the big questions, the ones that resonate with you, and then explore that, is where you find a lot of the more important lessons along the way of searching for these different answers. And I feel like as a doctor, what that's taught me is that oftentimes the most important thing you can do is to not lose that. Because what happens in life is people find ways of getting too busy with solving the immediate issues in front of them. Whether it's me working today, like having a patient that had a code stroke and being able to deal with that, you can find ways of making excuses to delay asking big questions because there are pressing matters. Okay, I got to pay these bills. I have to do all these other things that I'm obligated to do. But if there's never a moment of pause for you to have that time of reflection, eventually you either run out of time or you find that you've actually missed out of the opportunities to learn these lessons when they may have helped you at a different point in your life. So I think that's one aspect as well. But on the other hand, I think it's also taught me to be open to some of the weird ways God can speak to you. In other words, sometimes people in the lodge, whether they realize it or not, their statements or their perspectives can be very helpful to someone else in a problem they're dealing with or in other situations they face. So especially one of the lodges I mentioned was the Haitian lodge that I've been visiting. One of the things that I thought was very interesting going to that lodge, because you mentioned something interesting before about being freeborn.
Mm-hmm.
And what was very interesting about going to the Haitian lodge is that even though about 99% of the members are Black, what's interesting is that they are some of the most welcoming and loving people I've ever met within the lodge. And by talking with them and by learning from them, one of the things I found was that the reason that they have that welcome and that kind of openness is because they know what it feels like when you aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And they know what it feels like from, especially the history of Haiti, including what's happening now. They understand what that pain and what that kind of feels like, and the importance of why do these big spiritual questions matter? Why does it matter in how we include people that are different and being able to work with each other? I think that those are the things that help me, especially as a doctor, because I deal, especially in the hospital, with patients from different backgrounds, especially ethnic backgrounds, especially people in the African American community, where unfortunately some of them have had really bad experiences in the hospital system. And with that history, there's a lot of tension and there can be a lot of negative feelings with that. And unfortunately, that still persists in the medical community because of that. And that's why patients either get worse outcomes or unfortunately they die because of that, because of that inherent bias that we perpetuated. So by having these type of associations and opportunities to interact with people that are different, you learn to have a reference of seeing your patients as people you know personally. In other words, you can see someone you care about in the other person you're trying to help. So it doesn't become a job, it becomes a reflection of how you would want someone that you know to see you act with someone else similar to who they are.
Quick note to the one person. This is the first episode.
We got one?
I think.
Hey, no, it's not zero. I love it. We got one. No, this is fantastic. No, we got one. I wonder who it is. We'll probably figure it out who it is one of these days.
I always think it's a robot in China or something. But to the one viewer who's watching, this is the first time we've ever live streamed a podcast recording. And this isn't going to make the podcast episode. So for our one live viewer, the reason why is because they say that the camera adds 10 pounds to you. So I feel like I'm staring at 3 cameras right now. I am very self-conscious when it comes to pictures and what I look. There's a reason why I got into radio, right?
Yep.
But I figured out why you were looking at a blank screen and just hearing our voices instead of seeing our pictures was because when I started recording this podcast, for our use to edit, I didn't click the button that said record the video. So we can see each other. Johnathan and I can see each other, but you can't see us. Yeah. And so it's my mistake, but I'll tell you what, if you come back for our next one, I will click the button so that you can see us. Whew. And so now I don't feel so self-conscious about
well, see, that's what you need to do for the lodge tomorrow is let people know that you are live streaming so we can probably bump those numbers up from one person. I mean, hey, if we get even 10, I mean, let's be honest, like even 10 people, like, well, it's funny because like in the Aurora Lodge, they actually meet online as well to have discussions, and then sometimes it's 6 people, but even with those 6 people, I mean, you get 6 Masons together. I'm always fascinated how 6 people can have some of the deepest and craziest conversations. just with
Yeah.
6 people. So imagine having like 10 or more. Like I can't
It
imagine. It's
will.
pretty
It
wild.
will be something. Yeah. Well, the one thing I wouldn't do, and this is just a grumpy current master joke, not a past master yet. The last thing I would do is count on brothers from the lodge to make an appointment and set time to be somewhere that doesn't serve a meal.
Well, you know,
It's the only way you can get them to go.
At home. Like they got it right there at home. Like what better place? You get your own cigars, you get your own, wine. Like it's all right there for you.
Nice. I'm actually hang on just a second.
Yeah.
Jonathan, Ryan is our viewer on YouTube. Thanks for being our first.
Good deal.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryan. I swear next time we'll get the camera fixed. That was my bad button push issue. All right. So we took a little break there. Let's pick back up.
Yeah.
You have written extensively on this topic, which is why I knew this would be a good fit. And you and I have had several conversations on deity and faith and belief systems and values and traditions. And I knew that this would be a great episode. One of the things that is fascinating is you mentioned that there's the big answer that we're all trying to figure out what it's all about, like what happens at the end.
Yeah.
And how science and technology now, especially with like AI, are the modern tools that man is using to really explore the existence of God or deity. Mm-hmm. Jonathan, in what way do you feel that God is leaving like a little breadcrumb trail for us? We talked about, I do remember this was a big part of our discussion. Like he wants us to find him as the creator. He wants us to seek his love.
So I would actually say, like, in the past, I probably would have said something along the lines of, well, if you look at creation, you can see aspects of that kind of manifestation, right? Like that's like the classic Protestant view, right? Like, okay, you can, Paley's argument, the whole deal, like you look at creation, you can see something. But as I've actually practiced medicine, what I've actually found is that you can actually understand more about who God is in other people. It's the relationships that you have, because the lessons that I've learned as being a doctor, where I've seen God most prominently, is the patients that I've actually helped the most. And the ones that, in a way, I still keep in touch with, because of they'll tell me, like, you really impacted my outcome in the way I thought of myself and what I was going through. Because a lot of people in their hospital and they get very sick, like they can get very scared, and it can get very terrifying. They can feel very lonely. That's a very normal experience. And when you're able to connect with someone on a deep level beyond just the superficial and the physical, you realize there's a spiritual component. There's something else besides the physical that we all interact with, and that your interactions impact other people in ways you don't understand. And it's not always about the technology. It's not always about anything else. It comes down to simple, basic human relationships. Because at the end of the day, I can scan your brain through an MRI. I can CT scan it. I can put contrast through it. I can do all these tests. No neurologist can tell you what you're thinking in any of those images. They can't tell you who you are. They can look at your central nervous system. What's interesting, though, they can't tell you any of that. They can't tell you your past, your future. They can't tell you what you ate this morning. They can't say anything. The only way they can do that, and that's why as a neurologist, I like my field, because you still have to talk with people. The only way you can understand what's going on is by talking with them and then looking beyond what we're seeing on the surface. So the way I see it is that it's not just one angle. It's by realizing that the way God operates is on multiple different levels. I like to think about the Hermetic principle, as above, so below, right? Now, what I kind of view it from is the idea that God has given us enough experiences in creation, in the world that we exist, that we can understand from those experiences and what we see about the richness and what lies beyond. In other words, that God gives us these pointers to give us indications about, what exactly is God like? What exactly would different realms of reality look like? What things can we be surprised by? And if this is what the created world looks like, imagine what we can't understand. It reminds me of, like we discussed too, about the symbol of light in Freemasonry and how there's different colors and whatnot. But what's interesting is that in the electromagnetic spectrum, there's a lot that we do not perceive. There's just objectively a lot of things we don't perceive. In fact, as a neurologist, one of the things that I find crazy is that I believe it's every 7 years you actually have gone through, like, from metabolism, from all the processes in your body, you have recycled all the stuff in your body already. So you're not physically, you're a different person in 7 years. In other words, from all that, from all the cells dividing and everything, which is a wild thought, right? It's a wild thought to think about, right? That's why the Buddhist idea of impermanence is interesting, because it says, well, what is it that makes you you? Right. And that's the interesting question, right? Because when you hear that, you're like, well, that's bizarre. I have this feeling of who I am. But the truth is that your brain is doing so much every second, and you only perceive a small portion of it. Ultimately, I think that's why, from a spiritual perspective, it's all about that, realizing that we only perceive a small part of reality at every moment. We're not perceiving everything. And I think that's what makes me more excited when we're talking about God, is realizing that what's more interesting is realizing how much we don't perceive and how much we still have to learn and know. And realizing that even within this world that we live in, there's still an abundance of things that God possibly has to teach us that has yet to be discovered. And so I think that's the kind of frame I would say, is that it's through human relationships and being able to realize the different layers of reality that we sometimes don't perceive unless we have the right instruments, or, like in Freemasonry, the tools to actually approach these different areas.
Right. It's interesting you went down that path, because I remember us vividly having this part of the discussion, and this is what I got so excited about, was the fact that you are a very spiritual person, but you're also a scientist. And it's always that cross-section of you is what I find so fascinating, is that you're very rational, is how I would describe it. And while you're laying this out in my mind, I went to the movie The Matrix, and the scene that I'll never forget is when, our hero, Neo, finally gets up to the architect, and he's sitting in there with the room with all the TVs, and he's like, you're not the first version of you that's ever walked in here before. Like, what makes you think you're so special? And it was like, talk about deflating the tires, man. Like, it was just like, even as just sitting there in the movie theater, I was like, wow, like Neo just got zeroed out. Like, no one could hurt him, no one could punch him, but the architect just dropped him down a level. So with that rationale, just thinking about it that way, I was like, he's leaving us these breadcrumbs. He's putting very talented, special people on the earth that are asking these questions, that are seeking this knowledge. As you mentioned, like everyone from like artists to scientists to just everyday folks, we have all got this like special little gift that's inside of us, right? And he's put that seed there because he wants us to know. He wants us to find him. And if for some people it's like, for me to believe, I have to be able to sit in a room and have that experience, or I need to hear it, or I need to feel it, or I must have some way to experience so that I know that this is real, because everyone is telling me to do this massively difficult thing, which is believe. And you can't just make somebody believe something because you tell them to do it.
What's interesting is the thing that I find, because in the like in the Abrahamic faiths, the belief aspect is really emphasized. But if you look at the mystical traditions, especially the Sufi tradition, they actually say it's a practice. In other words, they don't view it as you are meant to just have these beliefs and that's the end. They say, no, it's about you have to experience and find it. And I think that's the thing about faith I find interesting, is that what people are really looking for is not just to be like, well, I have these beliefs and I'm going to follow them and I will ride or die for these beliefs no matter what anyone tells me. What really matters and what people really want is something that is able to deal with the complexities of living and with all the changes that we're experiencing, especially in the modern world with the technology, globalization, all these different things. And I think that's why it's, to me, fascinating when it comes to faith, because when I'm interacting with patients, it's a very spiritual experience, because yes, what they're dealing with is physical, but the thing that I always try to emphasize, especially medical students, is that if a person wants to die on you because they've lost hope or they lost that will to live, their body will kill itself. Like, it will physically let go, because your body and your brain, I like to bring this up about the placebo effect, when we call the mind-body connection. What's interesting is that if you look at the data on the placebo effect is really about the effect that relationships and social expectations has on medical treatments, right? So the thing I find fascinating is, for instance, they've done studies where they show that if you took morphine in an outpatient setting outside the hospital, like if you're in the hospital admitted for like a surgery or whatever, 50% of morphine's effectiveness will go down in an outpatient setting compared to an inpatient setting, even though it's the same drug, it's supposed to do the same thing. Because in an inpatient setting, patients are around an environment where they are being socialized to realize, oh, I'm in a hospital, these medications are supposed to help me, I have nurses around me, I have all these things. While if you're outside the hospital, it's not the same context or environment, and your expectation is different. So in other words, when I'm interacting with a patient, even if I give them a medication that may not actually have a functional effect. In other words, if I give them like saline, for instance, that's why they always bring a saline in these trials. The patient's expectation itself, the body will pull out reserves with regards to the way in which your hypothalamus and like the neuroaxis interacts with the rest of the body. Your body will kind of pull from its own reserves to try to heal itself. That's why when you look at things like shamans, or if you look at these other traditions, yeah, their medications sometimes didn't work. It's not doing anything. But the person believed that it would, and their body responded to produce that, right? So that's why in the hospital, I view that their social interactions are important, because if the patient doesn't believe in you, the medications won't work as well, because their body is actually fighting it, because they're thinking, okay, you are not listening to me, you are demeaning me, and I don't trust the people I'm with, it's not going to work. Wow. So when it comes to the medicine aspect, it's the relationship aspect that comes first. It's not me just prescribing a pill and then everything's going to be well. It doesn't work that way. In fact, that's why whenever I see my patients every day, that interaction every day matters to people, because let me just put it this way. If someone's seen you, and this is something I found interesting as a doctor, if you've seen someone for 3 or 4 weeks and you have to switch to another rotation, it's interesting how patients can get very angry that you're not there. In fact, I've had colleagues actually tell me of patients that were very upset I wasn't there because they trusted me. And when they see a new doctor, they're like, well, I don't know you. How am I supposed to trust you compared to the guy that was seeing me every morning at 6 o'clock, checking on me and making sure I was okay and dealing with all these issues? Why should I trust you?
Yep.
So ultimately what I'm getting at is that it's that human relationship element that underlies all these different things that we're talking about.
Yeah, that is the second coolest thing I've learned today. First coolest was that my body regenerates itself every 7 years. So yeah. I'm like my iPhone, it's system updates and it's a whole new inside. But the second thing is that there's a reserve me that will come to me's aid in an emergency situation to heal myself. It's fascinating. One other thing I want to mention, Ryan must have some friends, because we now have a couple viewers, which is awesome.
How many do we have now? I'm curious. What do we go up to?
We got up to at 1.3, so which is more than 0. Okay. So I'm at my last question. I know this is the first for everybody here. Yeah. But there is a chat feature. So Ryan or Ryan's friend, if there's something that you would like to ask me or Brother Johnathan, I'm sure we'd be happy to accommodate you. I'll give you some time to think. If you have anything, great. If not, no big deal.
That's kind of wild, though. We got 3 people.
Yeah.
No, that is actually kind of wild. You just doing this the first time. Like, I know it's like, I mean, it's not 0, so that's actually really good. No, I mean, you have to take it from the set. Like, you didn't announce this or anything.
You baby steps. Baby. Well, this was also trial and error. We already found out that I made an error and didn't click the button to turn the camera on.
Well, I mean,
defeats the whole process. All right, so Johnathan, we'll get you out of here on this question, unless Ryan or one of our streamers has something they want to chime in on YouTube. We've talked about Masonic teachings. They're shared throughout our degree work. They're also just a huge, heavy part of what we do when we do the independent study. We all tend to find brothers that are into one symbol or an area or a subject of interest. For you, what is this journey for Freemasons and our desire to collaborate with the grand architect of the universe in our life? What does that mean to you, this desire that we have?
I think the way I would describe it is to simply understand the nature of what love is. And the reason why I say that is because, when you look at other traditions, I think Christianity sometimes does a really good job of summarizing, in the New Testament when it's described about what is God at the end of the day. And there's the verse that says God is love. And when you look at these different traditions and when you think about that, ultimately that's the hard question, is what is love? And when you think about what does that actually mean when we're talking about God, like what is God's essence? And if we know it's love, well, what does that mean? And I think that's why when you think about Freemasonry and the tools that we talk about, the esoteric, all these different things, what I realize is that it's actually forcing you to understand what love is. And that's really hard, especially for some people that have dealt with a lot of difficult things. Like sometimes people have not experienced a lot of love and they don't really have that understanding. And I think that's why when people hear God, a lot of things can be projected from our relationships. And even like you said about the faith tradition that you were told, like this is the way that God is, and you don't deviate from that. And so I think for Freemasonry, for me, as I start learning, especially from you, the other brothers, it's about all this is about we're all on a journey to understand love, and we're all here to learn from each other from different backgrounds, different age groups, different, even different lodges. I mean, I come from even going from Texas all the way, even from the Midwest, coming from Texas to DC. It's completely different, the type of makeups within the different lodges and the way they interact and their history and the unfolding and whatnot. And it's always fascinating to me how the more that I've interacted with different brothers, the more similarities and differences I find. But learning what really matters is actually caring about them as people. It's kind of like one of the things you taught me was people care more about that you give them the opportunity to discuss and help facilitate their understanding and exploration than preaching to them as if you have all the answers. And I felt like that was an important lesson because as a doctor, that is really helpful when you're dealing with really complex and really difficult situations where, like, I had a patient recently where he had a stroke and we couldn't find the exact cause of it. We gave him all this workup and everything like that, and sometimes we don't find an answer. In fact, we call it a cryptogenic stroke, which means we most likely have an idea that it was from some type of clot or some other type of vascular process that led to it, but the evidence there is gone. It should be there, but we can't find it, which is an interesting terminology. But I say that because when we lose sight of the fact that there's those difficulties that we can't always explain, we lose that sense of humility and being able to connect with people and to do our best with what we're given with. And you don't understand that unless you've actually been around people where you're forced to actually listen and learn from them. And you only do that when you're in large groups of people and putting yourself out there and not having to be the one feeling like you have to have all the answers. Because the truth is no one has all the answers. If you were, you would either be God or you would only have answers within one specific area. That's why there's no PhD of all PhDs. Like, like there's not like the grand architect of all PhDs, right? Like that. I mean, the only person that does that is God, but there's no central person that has all the knowledge, right? Like it's the same thing in medicine. If you talk to a urologist, he can tell you everything about how to treat all these different virus disorders. Ask them about the brain, they'll say, I don't even know what my brain does. I can't even tell you what your brain does. Right. I think it's sometimes learning that it's not about the answers in Freemasonry that people are looking for. It's about how we practice and understand what love is and understanding God through that kind of process.
I love that you jumped with that. I would have not expected you to say that. And I immediately had to jot this note down because I found it to be so meaningful. I'm trying to remember the movie that it came from, but they were discussing the concept of hell and how the folks think the hell is, this is where the devil lives with the pitchfork and the fire, and it's a really hot place. And one of the characters said, no, that's not hell at all. That's what they tell you in books and movies. No, hell is really life without God's love. And you know, when you say that, you're like, well, that sounds really simple to say, but think about it. When the relationships that we have with other people, when those end and that love isn't there anymore,
Yeah.
you start to feel all kinds of desperate, scared. So you go through the whole gamut of pain.
But isn't that interesting though, the way you describe hell? Because when I did, because in residency you have to do like 2 or 3 months of ICU, intensive care unit. For all the viewers out there, like intensive care unit in the hospital is usually people that are sick enough to where you need a one-to-one nurse. They're usually intubated. They don't have the ability to maintain their blood pressure to a certain extent. There's all these different criteria, but the bottom line is you're very sick to the point where you can die. When you actually are in those environments where there's a lack of love, when there's family trauma and there's a lot of, disequilibrium in relationships, that's where a lot of the suffering that you see come from people. And especially when you practice as a doctor in those settings, it's very difficult because it can feel, it's almost as if you can sometimes feel like the love is being sucked out and all you're around is the worst aspects of living, where you're seeing people trying to survive, or people are just actively dying, or people that are pretty much at a point where they're clinically dead, but there's an unwillingness or a difficulty for the family to either let go or process it properly. And when you experience that, that was the only time I really understood what hell felt like. And it wasn't like you said, like the way you described, it wasn't fire and brimstone, wasn't anything. It was the lack of love and meaningful connection. And it's this terrible feeling where you just feel isolated and you just feel like there's no hope of something brighter coming through. And I think that gave me a perspective of what not only other doctors go through, but what patients and their families go through. It's that same feeling of what that kind of isolation does to a human being, even if there's other people around, when there's a lack of love, and how that impacts people.
Ryan did have a question, but I don't understand his question, so I wrote back to him. But he said, this last question is helpful, especially I'm on a journey myself and working to learn more. Would you have some further recommendations on getting started? So I'm not quite sure if his journey is in Freemasonry and life, but I guess that's a good question to pose to you. You're always asking me about good books or subjects to read on.
No. So if you're talking about good books to start reading that have really helped me, there's some classic ones that are really good just to think about. The one I really think is helpful, and especially I talked to another co-intern of mine, Viktor Frankl's work, not just Man's Search for Meaning, because I know it's like the big one that people are drawn to, but Viktor Frankl was actually a psychiatrist, but he actually lived through the Holocaust. And a lot of his observations was about the power of meaning. Like, what is it that makes, what if you strip humans away from everything, what is it that is the impetus? What is that central part of being human? And ultimately, he said it's about meaning. He says when people lose meaning, they lose their sense of self and they give up. And he said that part of the learning lesson in life, and I love the way he described it because he uses something he calls logotherapy. And it's a fancy way of saying that, like we were discussing before, we talked about God. People say God determines all the meaning. Like he's the one that gives you all of it. What's interesting is Viktor Frankl said it's actually a little bit richer than that. God can provide meaning, but God wants you to also develop your own meaning. In other words, God actually wants you to take charge of your life. And like an artist, say, you create your own meaning too. It doesn't just have to mean I don't need to dictate everything about your life. What I want you to do is I give you all these tools. What can you do to create meaning that resonates with love and what you want to give? And when you actually take those two perspectives, you don't see God as this dominating figure. You realize that, no, he wants you to be like God and actually take charge of who you are to create that meaning that is important to you. That's kind of like a little summary of Frankl's work that I think is very helpful if you're going through a dark time, or especially if you're trying to figure out where you want to go to, is to realize that you have the ability to create that meaning. The other books, I think, if you're discussing about difficult topics about death, we were actually just talking about this before the podcast, but, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's actually a version and a translation online that's pretty much like a commentary. But that one's very good because it discusses kind of a good summary of why we have difficulty discussing death, and then also how to approach death from the Buddhist tradition, which in a way is very interesting on how that is very helpful on engaging that particular topic as well. And I'm trying to think of another book that I found very helpful. You know, the other one was actually, interestingly, it's called, I found it at a bookstore. Let me think. I think it's, what's interesting, actually, you'll like this. The cover of the book is actually the point within the circle with two parallel lines. No, it really, because I was in the bookstore, I saw this, I'm like, why is there a Masonic symbol amidst all these books? And what's funny, I think it's called like The Art of Being. And what's funny, it was written by an artist, and he actually talks about how art is a reflection of philosophy and the human journey. And that, you know, that's why I've actually been more interested in artists recently, because unlike doctors, artists sometimes are much better at describing
I don't believe you.
Means.
No. Some of the deepest conversation. No, I'm kidding.
No.
You're saying doctors are dry and don't have any imagination?
Some of them don't. Have you ever talked to some of them? They don't, man. They only, because they're so focused on their practice, they lose sight of like the other. We can talk about other stuff, but I've seen that too. But but in the book, he actually describes about the different aspects of how art is actually a exploration into what makes you as a person. And that's interesting because when we talk about the fellowcraft degree, the ideas of music and math and arithmetic and also grammar, I realized that those are really more about learning to express yourself. It's much more about learning those tools to be able to articulate yourself, whether it's writing or music. It's about learning to have your voice. In fact, one brother in BBF actually made a good point. He said, the point of Freemasonry is to discover your divine voice. In other words, who are you as a person? Not what this person told you, not what your religion told you, but what is it that God wants you to speak into the world that is uniquely you through your actions or whatever you do. That's hard because it forces you to actually learn more about yourself and to kind of be open to the fact that you don't really know everything about yourself. And maybe a lot of what you have been told is really just what other people have told you, that this is the way of doing things. So I think those are the 3 books I would recommend. I'll have to find the other book and send it to you. But I think like those are the top 3 I think that I would recommend.
Well, Jonathan, I feel, and I know that we could talk all night because it's happened before. My phone literally has to warn and tell me it's in low power mode. Battery's about to die. But you have shed so much light on this, and as we've kind of teased, we are expecting to come back on the podcast. We have another episode planned where we're going to cover the death chapter and how in Freemasonry we are prepared for that through certain experiences that those in the know. And I'm looking forward to that discussion. But for now, Dr. Johnathan Kopel, my brother, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
No, and thank you for all the people that came on here. I know this is the first time that we tried a live group, so the fact we got up to 3 people, I think is pretty. I'm serious. It's funny. I know you're from New York, but the Aurora Lodge and the members, I'll tell them about this because they would love to be on the live. Like they would actually, because the people drive their cars and stuff. So if they knew about that, they just turn it on, and listen while they're driving and things like that.
I know.
Probably accidents would go up, and you'd probably be blamed for it or something like that. I mean, that wouldn't be a good legacy to leave.
Well, the other thing that's kind of scaring me now is like, do I tell people that we're going to be doing this? We have this whole schedule, and I don't know how people would even find out. Then I've got to learn about all this as well.
Well, I mean, if you actually on YouTube, you can actually schedule it. Like, there's ways that if you look at the people that do this, they actually say on their channels or whatever, like they actually have like a list of saying like we live stream at these dates, and then like if you have notifications, people can actually know about. So like. You can let people know ahead of time too, and they can schedule it too. And especially on your website, you can even link to that as well. So it's actually not that hard to do.
I feel so old. Like I feel like I should know these things. I'm not that old to be just gonna. I'm a young man still.
Yeah.
No.
it's hard. No, it's not. It's like all these different things. Even I have to still learn, especially like I had to learn 4 different electronic medical. No, was it no 3 of them? I had to learn 3 different electronic medical records, so I know what it feels like.
Ugh, yeah. I only had to learn 1, so it's painful. Yeah. Well, thank you, Johnathan. Thank you, Ryan and Ryan's friends for being on here. I'm going to hit the stop button, which I think says goodbye to you. But Johnathan, I'm still going to talk with you a little bit more about some stuff. Okay. Stop button.